Welcome once again to the DRH Show. Today I'm joined by the authors of End Your Covert Mission, Kerry and Dustin Brockberg. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Happy to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, Kerry and Dustin Brockberg. If you could just share to us your journey, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing. And of course, you're a couple, so probably you could also tell us a bit of your love story and how you ended up being co-authors. It's quite unusual.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Kerry Brockberg. I am originally from the Washington, D.C. area, grew up in Maryland, had a long education journey, which led me to UW-Madison, where I met Dustin. We completed our PhD programs at UW-Madison, and I focused in on rehabilitation psychology, working with folks with chronic illness and disabilities, which has led me to my career in working with folks with chronic pain, stroke, brain injury, and various other health conditions. But that's kind of a little bit of my story. I'm currently working as a licensed psychologist with a hospital here in Minnesota.
And then my name is Dustin Brockberg. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Minnesota, and I work at Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation, which is a large substance abuse residential treatment program. I think a big part of my journey was before in graduate school and meeting my wonderful spouse, Carrie, is I also served in the Army from 2004 to 2008, which was a big reason, a part of really wanting to get this book going and kind of merge all of our skill sets and knowledge together into one piece of literature. I would also say, in the sense of the love story, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge that Carrie and I just had identical girl twins. So that just adds to the complexity and wonderfulness of our life. So that's a bit about who I am and about who we are.
Great. So it's really more of an intellectual and also romantic, kind of meet up. But Dustin, you just mentioned that you were actually used to be a vet, used to work in the military. So was that also the kind of precursor for you for the title of your book? Tell us about the title of your book and what does it exactly mean for the veterans?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, serving the military between 2004 and 2008, I was a tank crewman. So that's a fancy word for I was short enough to fit into a tank. So I did that for a while. Kind of a fun experience. Did a tour in Iraq, did a hardship tour in Korea as well. The title of our book, End Your Covert Mission, is really trying to emphasize the idea that with a lot of veterans in the veteran community across the globe, is that we often continue on the mission of wanting to serve others, of wanting to be proud, to be strong, to be stoic, to do all those things that helped us get through our time in the military. And unfortunately, sometimes we continue to transfer that into our civilian life. And so a big part of this book is to be able to kind of poke holes and almost debunk some of those pieces of holding on to that mission versus starting a new mission of healing, hope, and actually resilience in a lot of new ways.
Do you want to add anything on that, Carrie? I also want to just, if you could talk to us about the mental health aspect of the military life, because I know it's also part of your work as a clinical psychologist. So if you could just add to what Carrie said about the title of the book and, the struggles and the mental health issues of the military and the veterans.
Yeah, I think that it's a great point to bring up mental health and also pain in connection to the book title. So, Covert Mission is also talking about these hidden experiences that veterans have in connection to pain, addiction, and mental health. These are things that are not readily seen by others. So, including maybe folks that are close to them, their families, or the wider community. So it's something that is easily to keep hidden in some sense because it's not maybe something that's readily seen. So we want to recognize that, name that, let veterans know we see that, and that they're not alone. There's other people experiencing the same issues that they are with their pain and addiction. So that's a definite call to the covert mission, trying to bring that out, that we don't need to hide that information. And it's good not to. It's really healthy. And we'll talk to you probably a little bit more about some of our tangible next steps, but really important to name these things for the veteran community.
Absolutely. I just want to tap into the lived experience of Dustin, of work in the military. So if you could kind of contextualize to us the difference between the veteran culture and the military culture.
Absolutely. So a big part of the misconception around culture in the military is just what you're mentioning, this idea that they're actually separately and uniquely different cultures. And that's kind of goes back to the idea of how much veterans can almost transfer military culture into their world as a veteran, and they don't actually necessarily disengage in those different cultural aspects. So a big part of military culture is kind of, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of sense of being stoic, of being strong, of not showing pain, of not showing emotions, or if you do show emotions, only certain emotions are allowed in that culture. And so another aspect of that culture is also substance use, alcohol use, ways to celebrate not only accomplishments, but also to use it as a way to cope with pain. And so some of those cultural aspects do transfer down to the veteran culture community. And interestingly enough, the veteran culture community is very widespread. It also is very dependent on different aspects of how you were in the military. So for example, if somebody was in active duty and you spent 4 years at one base, then you come home and you have no one, right? You spend 4 years with only your unit, and then you go home and you're just home with everyone else that's already been home in the civilian life. And so it can be a huge disconnect. It can also be a huge grief process that can happen as part of that. So I think there's some unique factors that veteran culture is just very unique to kind of how they come home and how they identify as a veteran. One of the biggest findings we found, and one of the things that we actually talk about in our book, is this idea that veteran culture, oftentimes veterans are willing to help other people, but they're not willing to necessarily ask for help themselves. That's a really interesting aspect of that kind of ethos of I need to care for other people. I need to keep my unit strong, but not so much myself. Also, this idea that people that are more engrossed in the veteran culture, which one would think theoretically would be a good thing, actually backfires in some respects, right? It's this idea that if we overconnect to one identity, we actually, in some respects, lose ourselves in that process. And so there's all these aspects that, again, are really unique to veteran culture, which is distinctly different in the military culture, which is much more of a warrior ethos, mission-driven piece, versus veteran culture is I got to hold on and I got to be the one that stays strong in my own civilian life too. So they're very kind of distinctly different ideas.
So one of the questions that comes into my mind about this book is that is this specifically targeting people who have lived experience of working in the military, or someone who knows about the veterans? Like I'm none of those. So why do you think this book would be relevant to me? What makes this book so important, Kerry?
Yeah, so Dustin and I say this book can really be for anyone.
Mm.
When you open it up, it's definitely written to the veteran audience. Our language really speaks to that. We take this not very direct, no nonsense approach, which is very much a part of the veteran culture. Some of the banter that typically happens for veterans, but aside from veterans, especially someone who myself, I don't identify as a veteran, but I am, Dustin's spouse. I have learned so much through Dustin and his stories that he's shared with me. Um, that learning more about veteran community and veteran experiences has been something that has made our life together so much more richer. I was seeing there was this really great quote that I saw yesterday that was talking about crisis, and how who's going through crisis, it's not just the individual themselves going through crisis, it's the family, it's the couple, it's the wider community. And veterans are a part of this wider community for so many people. So better understanding helps with that integration for veterans, helps the wider community. Um, So it's very, very helpful in that sense. And I think too, we've gotten feedback from folks that aren't veterans that are tangible next steps that we have, that provide like real time things to try out to help with pain. In the many aspects we talk about pain, are just very beneficial takeaways. So.
And I think this also covers some of the facts that Dustin have alluded to earlier, the idea of resilience and overcoming adversity. Because even though we don't have an experience of, working as a military, I think this is something that we can relate to. Given that we have experienced the pandemic, the idea of resilience is something that really resonates with everyone. But I just want to touch upon what you quickly said earlier. You mentioned some of the tangible benefits, and I think this is something that really, people who are looking to explore about the military aspect of clinical psychology and mental health, they want to learn what are the tangible benefits. So if either of you can talk about that.
Sure. So I want to piggyback on something Kerry said too, and then I'd be happy to answer that. Is this book is also for anyone who is going through pain in the many aspects of pain, and whether you're a veteran or not, whether you're a person trying to help a veteran, if you're trying to understand a veteran's aspect of a veteran's lived experience, it can really allow you to kind of take hold of some of that. I also think, to your point about the tangible next steps, in every single chapter of our book, we have these tangible next steps based on the content of that chapter. And so in every single aspect of emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual pain, all these different aspects of pain, we give concrete ways of, this is how I want you to look at this. This is how I want you to think about this. This is how I want you to try this. And it's okay if not all the things work. So for example, one example of a tangible next step is to talk about your pain, but to also open up your community around who you talk to, right? A lot of veterans believe I can only talk to veterans. We need to break that apart. And that's a really hard aspect of just really limiting your ability to talk to a certain subculture versus creating a huge community, a huge squad, so to speak, in your life that you can actually find support in different aspects. So that's just one example of that. Another example of that might be around grief. You mentioned the idea of the pandemic and COVID, and one aspect of grief that's hit not only the veteran community, but the larger community in society is a lot of folks have a disconnected relationship with grief, because oftentimes during COVID, you couldn't see the person that was lost. You couldn't go see them in the hospital. There was not these natural ways you typically would grieve or prepare to grieve a person that was actually passing away. And so the book is also trying to help you understand other ways to grieve that maybe doesn't necessarily need to have that aspect, but you can still go through your process. And it just kind of gives examples of unique ways to do that. So I'll let you jump in, Kerry.
Yeah, and I think too, it's interesting you're bringing up grief, right, Dustin? I think going back to what Dennis you had asked about, the connections for non-vets to vets, and we talk about that a lot in the book about the connection between vets and non-vets. Grief is really interesting. You bring up the pandemic. I love the example you give, Dustin, about like being away from your loved one during COVID and then being in the hospital. In some respects, I'm sure veterans can really relate to that and some of the grief and loss they experience in the military, not being right there with maybe someone they did lose, but finding out later that they lost someone. I think another topic that comes up in our book is talking about losing a loved one after the military to suicide, which is a very serious topic and important topic for veterans. And again, that happens a lot where these veterans are not connected right next to each other, but they're connected so much in their community. They find out, my goodness, they just lost one of my brothers or sisters to suicide, and how difficult that is. So I think there's again a lot of these related feelings of pain, loss, suffering, even addiction that veterans, non-veterans can come together with and understand about each other.
I think that's really one of the unique selling points of the book. Dustin, you mentioned about kind of the action aspect, the action plan after the book. So it's not just a narrative, it's not just a theoretical book. But other than that, are there any other things that sets this book from other veteran books?
Absolutely. So I think if you go on to bookstores or book apps, or we want to look at it, and you see the books that you often see with veterans, you kind of get two types. You get a veteran is trying to give their narrative and their story, and kind of like how they persevered through a very tough moment, typically, or you have something theoretical or something academic, right? You kind of get these two worlds. What you don't see is kind of to what Carrie just said, this idea of a no nonsense, direct, in your face in some respect. I'm just going to talk to you book that bridges all these topics together, right? There's not a book out there that we are aware of that actually bridges not only addiction, mental health, and pain within the veteran community, right? There's a book on pain, there's a book on addiction, there's a book on mental health, but they haven't all merged together. And it's such an important aspect and an approach to care to be able to put them all into one sitting and actually intertwine them of how they're all talking to one another. I think too, as also earlier mentioned, that there's not a lot of books out there that have a psychologist or psychologists writing to people in a non necessarily clinical way, where we're almost having a conversation with you in the book. It's less about here's the theory, now apply it. It's much more of a here's how this might look. Let's talk about it, right? We're going to be honest. We're going to be crass. We might even swear in the book, right? You never know. You're gonna have to read to find out. But it's interesting to think of like how a lot of books don't have that kind of language, and we really want to meet the veteran where they are versus being on an ivory tower or just being disconnected. So I think that this book is really unique in that aspect.
I think too, I want to piggyback a little bit off of what makes this book unique. Dennis, one thing that Dustin and I did, we thought that it was very important. You're going to, throughout the book, see, talk, 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 veterans talk. We actually decided prior to writing this that we thought it'd be very important to amplify voices of veterans. So throughout the book, we actually have quotes of folks that are opening up about their own pain, their own addiction issues, how they've got help, what that was like for them. And we call it the veteran voice. And the veteran voice, I think, is one of the most powerful parts of the book. It gives lots of different stories from different veterans, connecting back to these pain experiences, addiction experiences. And it really, I think the whole point of that for us was showing veterans and folks that are reading this book that there's language we can bring to this. There's ways that we can tell our stories with pain and addiction. So that's a very, very exciting part of the book. And Dustin even gives some of his own quotes too, which I thought were very powerful, which is exciting for folks to pick up and maybe be able to relate to someone.
Carrie, you mentioned about pain, so let's talk about that. And I understand when you mention about pain, it kind of encompasses some physical, emotional, and social pain. So tell us more about how pain was contextualized in your book.
Yeah, great question. So, pain in our book is broken down into a couple different categories. So, we talk about physical pain, we talk about emotional pain, and social pain. Those are kind of the three broader areas. So, within kind of the field of psychology, this isn't a new term necessary. It's called biopsychosocial pain or biopsychosocial functioning. There's lots of ways to look at it, but it's kind of a new term maybe for folks to hear, or maybe a reminder term for some people. And it's the idea that pain is not just something that's physically experienced. It's physically experienced by a lot of people, but pain can also be conceptualized through the psychological, mental health components that we experience, and also the social interactions that we have. So, physical pain in the book, we talk about chronic pain and different physical things that veterans may go through, some strategies to help with that. And I think sometimes vets do quickly connect to physical pain. It's a little bit easier for us to jump into. It's a little bit more tangible for folks to understand when you come home and maybe you have an amputated leg, or you experienced a spinal cord injury. Those are things that maybe folks can see. So sometimes explaining that to folks of these are my pain issues from the physical aspect can be a little bit easier. So we open up the book there. But we go on to talk about the social and emotional pain. Emotional pain being more so this feelings of mental health, some spiritual loss, grief, different topics related to anxiety, depression, PTSD. And then we move on to the social interactions. Reintegration is really difficult. The job in the military is very different than the job that they're going to get as a civilian. The values and mindset, the missions of the two different organizations might be very different and very isolating or difficult for veterans to navigate. So, um, I think we do a really good job of sharing, different types of pain and then relating that back to why addiction does come into play sometimes because we're trying to maybe self-soothe the pain we're experiencing. And we try to talk about, again, different ways that are a little healthier, more effective strategies rather than using in the book. So
Um, Dustin, give us a kind of a sneak preview because Carrie mentioned about addiction. I'm just kind of curious how this, addiction falls to your book. How does it relate to, the veteran and the military culture?
When you think about addiction, in a lot of respects, it can often come out initially as just substance use in the military, which can then turn into more of a substance abuse sort of presentation. So, as I alluded to earlier, that for example, in the U.S. military, it's very common to utilize alcohol as a way to celebrate accomplishments, to also cope with pain, to connect with people socially is also a very common thing. Um, and so as part of that, a lot of veterans, again, if they've learned to maybe not to not talk about their problems, not talk about emotional pain that's happening for them, it then creates a really unique dynamic where they also remember how substances help them cope with pain. And so you kind of bridge those together, and it's very common that addiction can come from that. In fact, I remember reading research not too long ago that talked about how in the VA system here in the United States, one researcher found that 10% of people, when they first went to the VA, their first time, likely would meet criteria for some sort of a substance use disorder. 10%, that's 1 in 10. That's a crazy number. And so it's important to acknowledge that it's not even necessarily addiction as it is the relationship with substances as a way to avoid, numb, not feel pain is really creating a funky dynamic for a lot of vets, let alone you have the invisible wound of mental health that's also creeping somewhere around this, right? So it's addiction and mental health put together as a co-occurring thing, and they're talking to one another, they're screaming at one another, and it's hard to just stop one and not the other, or it's hard to keep one going and not the other. So addiction is a very prevalent thing in the veteran community and in the military community as well. And I think we're kind of taking some interesting strides nowadays to kind of talk more about it more openly within the veteran community. There's a lot of veteran-specific AA and actually NA groups. There's a lot of new ways that's actually creating a lot of opportunities for veterans to talk again, but to also change what we would call their schema or core belief around what it means to be in pain and what it means to actually heal. And so I think that again creates opportunities, and our book really kind of speaks to how we can reevaluate or even change our narrative around how to heal and how to think about pain and how to talk about pain, but also how to talk about addiction. And so I think it's a very important topic that's going to continue to get more and more traction as we keep going.
I think the only thing I'd add to Dustin, and it's specifically for pain population, right? Right now with the opioid epidemic being such a hot button, something that we're paying more attention to as well. We talk about opioids in our book a little bit about just where we've come, things that there's different initiatives that are being taken right now. And I think one way we're trying to support that initiative is taking this more preventative approach of here's some tools that we can try out in comparison to medications that were initially a short acting solution that has turned into this more pervasive long term for so many veterans and even non-veterans. So that's something that we definitely pay attention to, especially since we are talking about physical pain as well, which is it's common to have that prescription or
Mhm.
whatever transition when you're going through physical pain like that. So
Yeah.
I,
And so
I, Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to give an example of all this coming together, is imagine a veteran who comes home with back pain. They go to the VA system. They continue to try to find ways to manage this, and the VA is very helpful for them in some respect. But when you have back pain, you can't do certain things you typically would want to do, play with your kids, things like that. So all of a sudden, you're not able to do things that you enjoy. You're in physical pain. You likely feel alone because you're also not able to do some of these things. You're not going out and seeing friends. And so all of a sudden, you have this loss of community, loss of even being able to do what you want to do. You have this constant pain, and then you might then as part of the actual treatment. Back in the day, at least, we used to use a lot of opioid medication to kind of manage pain, and some folks end up getting addicted to that medication. So now you add an addiction, right? So it's all those aspects coming together that are influencing one another and just creating this like hornet's nest for a person and also for a veteran. So just to kind of speak to that.
I really find it interesting how you laid out the kind of triad of pain, addiction, and also of the veteran culture in your book. And I think your background as clinical psychologist really helped a lot. But I was just wondering, because given your academic background, do you have any plans of writing a sort of a more academic type of this book? Because you mentioned earlier that this is a no-nonsense book. And of course, in the academic community, that's not how you write. You kind of you just word things differently in academia. You both did your PhD. I'm sure you can reflect on that.
yeah, that's a good question, Dennis. One thing, and we'll see where this ends up going, but we've the entire time while we were writing the book, we were saying, wow, this would be really cool to get into like a workbook format, something for clinicians or even professors to have as a teaching tool for clinicians, psychologists, social workers, LADCs, licensed drug and alcohol counselors. So we could see ourselves doing that for sure. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully this has gained some traction, and that'll maybe be a next step. We'll see what happens.
Absolutely. Now we're already going towards the end of this interview, but I just want to hear from you the writing process. Talk us about the writing process, because you're quite unique. I've also co-authored a book, and sometimes it's kind of a challenging process. But I don't live with my co-authors. We don't live in the same house, so there's kind of like that's there's a stop, there's a pause, but I would imagine it's kind of different when you live together.
So this is a really fun story for us. So I'm glad you asked that question, and I think Dustin tells the story better than I do. But so I was pregnant the entire time, right? That we wrote this story, or wrote this book. So we're sitting in Starbucks, and I can't have caffeine, and we're sitting there with our two girls. So it's just funny, like it feels like the four of us wrote this book together, which was really exciting and different. But I think kind of going backwards, working together, it's funny that you say that the way you do, Dennis, because a lot of people are like, how was it writing a book with your spouse? And I think we have the fortunate connection, Dustin and I, for going through the PhD program somewhat at the same time together. So we did a lot of editing of each other's work prior to, and we know each other's style and how we talk. So I think it made things easier in that aspect. So um, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Dustin. You tell the Starbucks story better than me.
Well, I think in a lot of respects, to your point, Carrie, is that we do have very different writing styles, and I think we knew that going into it. And even the way that we started this book was kind of an interesting narrative as well, because we weren't necessarily in a position where we were planning to write a book. It was kind of an opportunity that kind of presented itself, and we kind of had that approach of like, let's just go at it and just see what we actually end up writing. And we made it a mission to only write at Starbucks, and so kind of not writing at home, which was a really important balance for us to kind of keep our home life, and our writing life there. And so, we got to know the staff very well at our local Starbucks, and I know that was a lot of fun to do that. And for me, it was interesting too, because I was just, chugging, Americanos and caffeine, and then she was over there sitting not doing that. And so it was kind of a weird dynamic there, but I have to give her a lot of credit. But I think in a lot of ways too, that one of our approaches to this book was really to just be authentic and be honest and not try to overthink a lot of it. And we had a really great editing team as well. And so we could really just kind of free write and just kind of like get it out, or the point we're trying to make, and then kind of work our way back to like, okay, so how do we bring this into the form of a book? And it was able to work out really well in that respect. And it also helped us understand that, like, yes, we definitely can have academic writing. We know that skill. We've published in other areas of our career, but it's such a different way to write. And so I think not knowing how to write like that was almost easier for us, because we had nothing holding us back of saying, oh, I can't do this or I can't do that. We didn't know any better. So that was almost an easier aspect for us.
And of course, this book is available on Amazon.
Yes, so available for pre-order right now and coming out officially November 1st.
Okay. So for anyone who's watching, as soon as the link is available, I'll put it on the description notes so you can have a copy of your book. Now, Kerry and Dustin, it's really interesting talking about your book and also your passion about the mental aspect of the veteran community. But I'd like to wrap this up on a lighter note, and I'd like to know more about you as a person, not just as a psychologist, but as an author. So we'll have some quick fire questions to wrap this up. So we'll start with Kerry first. If you haven't been a psychologist, what would you have pursued in life?
I feel like this is a boring question for me. I love teaching. I actually got the chance to teach while I was in my PhD program, and I love teaching students, especially college students. I probably would have done some sort of teaching, or even maybe teaching little kids. I don't know. I love teaching in general. So.
And Dustin?
I always had this weird belief of being an astronaut, and then I tried skydiving once, and that didn't go so hot. So heights really are not my thing anymore. So I'm very happy that dream didn't come to fruition. But I would probably say astronaut.
Okay. And what were you afraid of as a child?
Oh my goodness, I was afraid of the dark. And it's funny because I'll still now be like, all right, Dustin, go check all the doors, make sure.
And I would say it would probably be the 3 S's. It'd be spiders, sharks, and snakes. Can't do them. Even if I'm in a place where I know there's no sharks, I'm still worried about sharks. So just kind of a continued fear.
Yeah. Not allowed to go on any cruises at our house.
Correct. That's
and what is your favorite word in another language?
Oh, I know mine. So mine is Lala Salama, which is in Swahili, I believe sweet dreams or good night. I actually went to Kenya to work with kids with autism, providing sustainable autism treatment at the very start of my PhD program. And that was my favorite. And we actually have a little plaque in one of our babies' rooms that says Lala Salama. I think I love that.
And it sounds like a sweet word, Lala Salama. Yeah.
I know, Lala Salama. I love that.
And I would say probably Auf Wiedersehen is my favorite word or phrase in a different language, just in the sense of it's this idea of not saying goodbye. I think that's such an important aspect in LA culture, but just in relationships of I will see you again versus just goodbye.
Okay. And finally, the floor is all yours. If people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at?
So we have a website, Drs Brockberg, DRS Brockberg, our last name, BROCKBERG.com. You can go on there and find out more information about our book. We also have a Facebook page, Drs Brockberg, and an Instagram, so at Drs Brockberg. And it's on Instagram, DRS Brockberg. So.
And I would just add too that we also have profiles that you can follow on not only Amazon but also on Goodreads, on Barnes and Noble, and there's many ways to get a hold of us. And I'm sure we'd be happy to share our emails as well if that'd be helpful.
All of those links will be on the show notes for anyone who's interested. Well, Kerry and Dustin Brockberg, authors of End Your Covert Mission. It's really great to have you here on the DRH show, and I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having us.